everyone. It's really lovely to see so many of you come along. That's great. Thanks for coming along to hear me talk about fact and fiction in Unlawful Things. So a little bit about the novel to start off with. It's a contemporary mystery thriller and it's set in present-day South London and Kent, but it's all about the dangers of digging up secrets from the past. And it was inspired by a walk that Phil and I did more than 10 years ago now, from Southwark Cathedral to Canterbury Cathedral. And we walked along the path of the pilgrims that Chaucer wrote about, so the Canterbury Tales pilgrims. And we learnt lots of exciting things on that walk. One of them that it's a long way from London to Canterbury and you should probably take more than 3 days if you're going to try and walk it. But one of the things we learnt was that Christopher Marlowe, who is an Elizabethan playwright and was a rival of Shakespeare's, was born in Canterbury, and then he was killed at the age of 29 in a knife fight in Deptford. And we found this out because we were walking past a churchyard with these amazing skulls that you can see in the picture here, and they're on the top of the gateposts. And so we went in and we had a look and found the plaque that said this was where Marlowe was buried. Thought that was quite interesting. And then when we got to Canterbury, we discovered that he was born in Canterbury. So that kind of got me thinking a little bit about Marlowe, and that was really the start of the novel.
Anna, you say it's based on history, but can you give us some pointers as to where the line is between fact and fiction?
Mm-hmm. So, what really gets me interested is that kind of blurry line between fact and fiction. So it's very much real history. So everything in Unlawful Things kind of could have happened. You know, there's nothing to say in the historical record that these things couldn't have happened. But obviously, I took it very much as a sort of jumping off point. So it could be true, but some of it probably isn't. But I make a lot of use of real life locations in South London and Kent, which once we're no longer on lockdown, hopefully you can visit. And those include places like Dulwich College, St Nicholas Church in Deptford, Cobham Hall down in Kent, Rochester Cathedral, the Eastbridge Hospital in Canterbury, and St Nicholas Church in Harpledown near Canterbury. So the historical record is very much a kind of jumping off point. But I thought it might be quite fun to start off with a bit of a question and answer to see if you can spot what's real and what's made up.
Don't forget you can type your answers into the chat box if you'd like to, and we'll try and see who's got them right at the end.
Okay, so fact or fiction? The founder of Dulwich College was the first person to play the role of Dr. Faustus in the Christopher Marlowe play. Was that fact or was that fiction? Next one, number 2. Edward Alleyne, who was the founder of Dulwich College, wrote letters to his wife, calling her his good sweet mouse and asking her to dye his orange stockings black. Is that fact or fiction? And number 3, Cobham Hall was plunged into scandal in 1963 when the heir to Cobham Hall was accused of killing his former lover with a shotgun. Fact or fiction? Number 4, Christopher Marlowe's body was flung into a plague pit at St Nicholas Church in Deptford. True or false? And finally, the body of St Thomas Becket was removed from Canterbury Cathedral before the shrine was destroyed, and it was hidden so well that it's never been found. True or false?
Intriguing. We better pay attention to what you're saying then. Okay, Christopher Marlowe is an important figure in the novel. Can you tell us something about him?
Sure. I mean, Marlowe, I first came across him when I studied Dr. Faustus back at school for A-level. He's a playwright who was born the same year as Shakespeare. Like Shakespeare, he was of fairly humble origins. He was the son of a shoemaker in Canterbury. And he went to the prestigious King's School, which is still very much attached to Canterbury Cathedral. He must have been a bright lad because he won a scholarship to Cambridge University, awarded by the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Archbishop Parker. And when he was at Cambridge, he became a spy, and he was working for the Elizabethan Secret Service, which might be how he could afford such fancy clothes. We think this is a portrait of him. It's in Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, this portrait, and we think it is of Marlowe, although it's not completely certain. And he's wearing extremely fancy clothes here, and not the sort of thing that poor scholars were really meant to be wearing. So maybe this was his sort of celebration of his first pay packet from when he went off to France on the Queen's business. As well as being a spy, he wrote 6 plays and several epic poems as well. A lot of his plays were written for the Rose Playhouse on Bankside and the companies that played there. And the other thing that you find out when you start researching Christopher Marlowe is that he was absolutely always in trouble. Every time he appears in the historical record, it's because he's been taken up by the magistrates for fighting. He was involved in the murder of a man in Hog Lane in Shoreditch, although he didn't strike the final blow, he was involved in the fight. He was sent home from France, I think it was, in disgrace for encouraging a goldsmith to counterfeit coins. And then he was accused of all sorts of things that you didn't want to be accused of in Elizabethan England, including atheism and homosexuality, which were all very much frowned on at the time. But the interesting thing was, he always seemed to get away with this, right up until the day when he didn't. As I said, he died young. He was only 29, and he was killed in a knife fight after a dinner in Deptford by a member of the Elizabethan Secret Service. And we know from the inquest who killed him, a man called Ingram Fraser, and we know how he was killed. Supposedly, Ingram Fraser was attacked by Marlowe with a knife, and he turned Marlowe's dagger sort of back on him, and he was stabbed through the eye socket. So very gruesome. But the big question is why he was murdered, and we don't really know the answer to that. So that was something that kind of got me interested.
Plenty of material for a novel there then. Can you tell us more about his links to Canterbury?
Yes, this is a very interesting building, the Pilgrims Hostel in Canterbury. It might have been the first school that Marlowe attended. We know he was at the King's School, but not until he was 14 or 15. So he must have got his letters somewhere. And this fascinating place, the Hospital of St Thomas the Martyr in Eastbridge, was founded just 10 years after St Thomas Becket was murdered in the cathedral. And you can go there now, and if you go down the steps in that little arched window that you can see there, the pilgrims used to sleep in the undercroft underneath the building here, which you can go and visit. These were, of course, pilgrims to the shrine of Thomas Becket, of St Thomas Becket, who was murdered in the cathedral, Canterbury Cathedral, in 1170. And upstairs in the Eastbridge Hospital, where you can see the arched windows, it used to be a chapel. It's a chapel now, again, but it used back in Elizabethan times, it was the schoolroom, and we think that that's why the foundation, which is still running today and still has almshouses today, we think that's why the foundation survived when a lot of religious foundations in Canterbury didn't, was because it was doing useful work. And so when the commissioners, Henry's commissioners, came and destroyed a lot of the religious foundations, they could say, well, no, look, we are educating the sons of the tradesmen of the city, and so we're doing useful things. And it was very close to where the house where we think Marlowe was being brought up. So it's quite likely that he would have gone to this school and perhaps been taught by people who were monks who were previously at the foundation in Canterbury Cathedral. So I thought that was quite interesting. Because, of course, the big thing about Canterbury was that this was supposedly where Thomas Becket was buried. Why was he buried there? Well, he was buried because he was murdered, obviously, in the cathedral, and his tomb in Canterbury Cathedral was the site of the place where lots of pilgrims came to, right up until it was destroyed hundreds of years later on the orders of Thomas Cromwell, acting for Henry VIII. And the strange thing about this is no one actually knows what happened to Becket's body. We know the shrine was destroyed. We think the body was taken out, but we don't really know what happened next, which is very odd. There are some reports that it was taken and burnt, and that was certainly the story that reached the Pope, who was very shocked by this. There were stories that it was perhaps taken out by the monks before the commissioners got there and buried somewhere else, maybe in the cathedral. There was even a story that it was shot out of a cannon, so they could never find the rest of the bones, which is the most amazing story, but I don't know that there's any truth in it. I don't know if anyone's read the Hilary Mantel's new novel, The Mirror and the Light. The whole thing about the breaking up of the shrine is part of the book. It's very interesting, and Thomas Cromwell, someone in Mantel's book, puts it to him: did you really have the body shot out of the cannon? And he says in the book, I didn't, but damn, I wish I'd thought of that. That would have been brilliant. So I quite like the fact that Hilary Mantel took that story on a bit. So from one grave to another, St Nicholas Church in Deptford Green is where Marlowe is buried. And he was buried there because this was closest to the house where he died. And as I said, he was buried, he was murdered after a dinner in Deptford with members of the Secret Service. We don't know exactly where he was buried, but there's a bit of a clue. These skulls that are on top of the gateposts outside the church, apparently they usually indicate that there were plague burials in this graveyard, or in any graveyard where you see these things. So we know that there was plague at the time that Marlowe was murdered. He'd actually been out of London because the theatres were closed. He was down in near Chislehurst with his patron, Thomas Walsingham, and he was then called back to the because he'd been accused of atheism, and he was told he had to go to the court at Greenwich and answer questions about these charges. And the day before, or a couple of days before, when he was waiting for his court date, he was called for this dinner, and that's why I'm a bit suspicious about the fact that, you know, he was due to go and give evidence in court, and suddenly the Elizabethan Secret Service, you know, he got into a fight, and oh dear, Marlowe's dead. And I do wonder whether there were people in the Elizabethan Secret Service who thought that perhaps he knew things that they didn't really want him to talk about in the court.
Plague pits. Things could be worse then. You also found out some important information close to home, I think.
Yes, I started researching Elizabethan theatre because I'd had this kind of idea that maybe Marlowe had written one last play and that had been suppressed, and perhaps that was the secret that led to his death. So I wanted to find out more about theatre at the time of Marlowe and Shakespeare. And I found out that the Dulwich College archive, Dulwich College is just down the road from where Phil and I used to live in Crystal Palace, has about the world's best archive of Elizabethan theatre. And that's because Edward Alleyne, who was the principal actor of the Rose Theatre, where Marlowe and Shakespeare's plays were performed, retired to Dulwich, and he bought land and founded Dulwich College. And of course, his papers were bequeathed to the college on his death. And you can see here a page from his diary here, but there are also lots of letters between Edward Alleyne and his family, often when he was off on tour, for example, when the plague closed the London theatres. So when plague closed the theatres, they didn't just close everything and all stay at home. They went off on tour around the country, which in the current situation rather makes you think, you know, perhaps they were the super spreaders of their day, taking plague around Britain. But Alain's father-in-law was Philip Henslow, and he was the owner of the Rose Playhouse. So there were lots of letters between the two of them whilst Alain was off on tour. And this page you can see here from Henslow's diary, it's an account book and it's an absolute treasure trove. It has all of his business dealings, information about building the Rose Theatre, right down to how much the nails cost. There are lists of what plays were on what date, how much money they took, information about new plays that he'd commissioned and how much he paid for them. So it's a completely fascinating record, and it's a really good place to start researching Elizabethan theatre. But one of the things I found most interesting in the archive was what wasn't there. And that's that there were no letters between Edward Alain and Philip Henslow about Marlowe's death, which is odd because there were lots of letters covering that period. You know, the players were off out of London. There were letters from Alain saying, can you remind my wife to dye my stockings black? I need more black stockings. Obviously, whatever play he was doing, he needed black, not orange stockings. He would write very affectionate information or letters to his wife, calling her his mouse and all the rest of it. But he didn't, neither of them mentioned the fact that Marlowe had died. And given that he was probably their biggest playwright, and he'd written the plays that had made Edward Alain the star actor that he was, that seems really, really surprising. So I did wonder, is there something missing there? Is there a bit of a mystery that I can have a play with that?
A conspiracy of silence, more fertile ground. Cobham Hall is an important location in the book. Can you tell us something about that?
Sure. This is Cobham Hall. For anyone who doesn't know, it's a magnificent Elizabethan era mansion, and it's not far from Gravesend, near Cobham, the village of Cobham. And I found out about this because I wanted somewhere for one of my characters to live. I had this idea of this terrifying aristocratic lady called Lady Joan, and I wanted her to live somewhere between London and Canterbury, and I wanted her to live somewhere where something might have been left or hidden back in Elizabethan times. So I was kind of researching a little bit about that, and then I found out about Cobham Hall, and Phil and I went and visited on an open day. It's actually a girls' school now. I don't think we were pretending to be prospective parents, but we did manage to go on an open day and have a look around, and read up about it, and I basically couldn't resist it, that trying to bring it into the novel, the combination of this magnificent place and also the amazing history of the hall. It's been there a long time. The first Baron Cobham built the manor house back in the 13th century. But during the period that I was interested in, the Elizabethan era, Queen Elizabeth visited back in 1559. And this man here in his fancy garter robes was Henry Brooke, Lord Cobham, and he was a real favourite of Elizabeth I. But it all went a bit pear-shaped when she died and was succeeded by James I. Cobham was imprisoned in the Tower of London along with Sir Walter Raleigh, who was a friend of his. And they were both accused of treason. And no one really knows whether this was a stitch-up, basically. The only evidence against Walter Raleigh was the evidence of Henry Brooke. And it actually started a legal precedent because Raleigh defended himself in court and said, look, it's unfair that I should not be able to question Lord Cobham. He should be brought into the courtroom and I should be able to cross-question him. And he wasn't allowed to, but it created quite a stink, and people thought, well, no, that's fair enough. You ought to be able to question people if that's the only evidence against them. So that kind of went into legal history, that you should be able to cross-question your accuser in court. But unfortunately, that came too late for Walter Raleigh. He was eventually beheaded. Lord Cobham managed to keep his head, but he was in the Tower for a very long time, and the Brooke family was stripped of Cobham Hall and all of their titles, and that went on to the Darnley family.
Talking of the Darnley family, Cobham Hall has its own mausoleum, which is another important location in the book. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the mausoleum is the most extraordinary building. It was built by the Darnleys, as you said, and in the late 18th century. It's this huge, great building up on the hills, or a hill above Cobham Hall. So you can see from the top of the mausoleum, you can see right across the countryside. And it's a really extraordinary neoclassical design. It's got this whacking great pyramid on the top, apparently inspired by the grand tour that the Darnley at the time had done, and also apparently a painting by Poussin. And as you can see, there are all these niches for burials inside, but no bodies. All of the niches are empty. And that is apparently because the Bishop of Rochester, who was supposed to come and consecrate the mausoleum, there was some sort of falling out with him. I wonder whether he just looked at this building and thought, that doesn't look like a particularly Christian building to me. That looks a bit pagan. So maybe he decided against it. But yeah, when I visited the mausoleum, I was kind of having, I was still writing the book, and I was thinking about where would be a good place to imprison somebody, and I was thinking how scary it would be to be imprisoned in a mausoleum with all these slots for dead bodies.
Sinister. You obviously did a lot of research. How did you go about cramming it all into the book?
Yeah, you're right. I did do loads of research, which is absolutely, was my favourite bit of it. But the difficulty then is not to try and kind of cram all of the research into the book. I needed to know it, and it needed to be there in the background, but it was really important that it doesn't overwhelm the story. All of the characters are imagined, all of the present day characters. You really couldn't kind of take modern day characters and put them into fiction, I don't think, or not very easily. But obviously I used a lot of real life locations. And that was a bit of a challenge, because how do you get across the atmosphere of a real life place, especially if some of the readers are going to know it quite well. So you want to make sure you've got it's accurate, but at the same time you don't want to kind of bore people and hold up the action by making it a sort of guidebook approach. So what I did with that was really thinking about what my characters were going through at the time, so therefore what they might notice about the places that they were describing, or that I was sort of seeing through their eyes. So for example, one of the characters is a young journalist for a local paper, and he's going to Cobham Hall to try and interview Lady Joan. So he's kind of a little bit overawed by how big it is. He's wondering, where's the front door? Where do I actually go? Am I going to be able to get in and see her, or am I going to be, thrown out by the butler? So it's really about trying to think just about their experience, and then try and convey what they would notice about the places through that.
Thanks. Lots of things to juggle and bear in mind there then. You set us some questions at the start. Shall we see how well we did with them?
Okay. Right, so the founder of Dulwich College, Edward Alleyne, he was indeed the first person to play Dr. Faustus, and he did write to his wife, calling her his good sweet mouse, rather sweetly, and asking her to dye his stockings. There were a number of scandals at Cobham Hall, but not in 1963, and as far as I'm aware, nobody in the 60s was accused of killing people with shotguns at Cobham Hall. Christopher Marlowe's body, it's possible that it went into the plague pit. We don't know. As I said, we know that there was a plague pit that was probably in operation at the time when Marlowe died, and given that he died in murky circumstances, maybe, but we don't know that for sure. The question of the body of St Thomas Becket, well, it's possible. In some of the other cathedrals around the country, so for example in Durham Cathedral, there was apparently a plan by the monks that St Cuthbert's body would be taken out of the shrine and hidden somewhere safely until the commissioners had been and gone, so they could then rebury it in the cathedral. I don't think that actually happened, but they certainly were making plans for it. So yeah, it's possible, but we don't know for sure.
I think we had truths for every single one of them. I don't think I saw a false one. So yeah, well done everyone for having a go. Okay, so questions. First of all, I'd like to ask one. Can you tell us what's happening with the next book?
Yes, the next book is on the way. Hopefully it will be published in the autumn. I'm working on editing of it now, and it is a follow-on from Unlawful Things. Working title, Poison Tree, and it takes on Helen Oddfellow to the next stage in her story. And what Christopher Marlowe was to Unlawful Things, the poet William Blake is to Poison Tree. So that's the world she's going to explore next.
Great. We've had a nice comment from a Mr. Duncan Core here. It's more of a comment really, but he's saying it's interesting looking at the perspective of the modern age where everything is recorded in perfect detail. So I wonder if there may be coming out from that, there may be less room for fiction as we go on, where everything is recorded and there's not much room for doubt.
I'm sorry, Phil. I didn't hear that.
That's all right. It was more of a comment, really, but it was more to say that that we have the benefit of the past is that it's not so completely recorded as things are today. So
that's true. That is true. Yes, you always need gaps in the historical record if you're going to write a mystery.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Okay, I think that's all the questions. So I guess next it'd be good to know how to find out more, what to do next.
Sure. Well, there's my website, annasaburnlane.com. If you go to my website, if you're interested, you can sign up to the newsletter, which lets people know what's happening. But also, if you sign up, you get this little map that you should be able to see in the corner there, which is a map of some of the places that Helen Oddfellow takes people on in a guided tour that she does at the beginning of the book. And it's all around Bankside, and it has places like the Rose Playhouse and Winchester Palace and Southwark Cathedral and Shakespeare's Globe. So you can do a little sort of self-guided tour if you want to sign up for the newsletter and get the little map. I've also got a Facebook page, so facebook.com/AnnaSayburnLane. I'm on Twitter @BloomsburyBlue, and if you would like to get in touch, then you can do so via my email hello@AnnaSayburnLane.com.